All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining the evening session of the Fall 2018 Florida Voter Protection webinar hosted by Advancement Project. My name is Andrew Hairston. I'm a staff attorney at Advancement Project's National Office. Before we really get into the substance of the organization, I want to give a shout out to the collaborative of organizations that has worked on this series of webinars, including Advancement Project. We also have the Asian and Pacific Islander American Health Forum, DEMOS, Faith in Action, the NAACP, the National Congress of American Indians, the National Urban League, Race Forward, and Unidos US. We are 9 leading racial justice organizations really focused on achieving that goal and are funded and supported in part by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, which made this webinar series possible. So we'll go ahead and jump into the presentation. So a little bit more about Advancement Project. We are a national racial justice organization that uses legal communications and organizing strategies to build power in communities of color, and all with the goal of eliminating structural racism in this country. You can learn more about Advancement Project at our website, advancementproject.org. In addition to a few other program areas, we have a Power and Democracy program, which served as a conduit for this webinar. Our Power and Democracy program is focused on increasing access to the polls for Black and Brown communities and ensuring that these communities have an equal say and opportunity to participate in American democracy. Again, my name is Andrew Hairston. Honored to be your host for this webinar series. I am a staff attorney at Advancement Project's National Office. Now I'm only licensed in Louisiana, but this presentation was reviewed by a Florida Bar attorney for general accuracy. And I'd also like to give a shout out to my supervising attorney, Danita Judge. Why do we vote? As we really get into some of the mechanics of voting in Florida and what registration requirements are, I wanted to take some time to think about this ever-present question, particularly in America, and especially for Black and Brown communities. Recognizing the history of racial discrimination in voting in America is quite imperative and necessary to think about this question. Why we vote? For dignity, for self-determination, to really ensure that the legacies of those who came before us are memorialized in what we do and say, and really to ensure that society reflects our values and what we hope to create for the descendants and the people to come. I wanted to highlight a quote from a Supreme Court case that was decided after the Civil War during what we call the Reconstruction era of American history, Yekwo v. Hopkins. And during this Reconstruction period, there were some gains made by African-American people in the United States in terms of voting ability, particularly for Black men, and representation in various state legislatures and communities. But there was also a significant backlash to that we'll go into. But the quote says, voting is regarded as a fundamental political right because it is preservative of all rights. And again, going to that concept of creating a society that one wants to see, that communities want to see, voting bears on education policy, employment opportunities, housing. It really does, as this quote from Yekwo says, preserve all other rights, which makes it that much more significant as we think about the present moment that we're in. So, in focusing on Florida and focusing on the work that Advancement Project does, we wanted to uplift during this presentation Desmond Meade, a really dynamic civil rights activist in Florida who is working assiduously for power in communities of color throughout Florida, and is one of Advancement Project's partners, particularly in our power and democracy work. And Desmond says, a more inclusive democracy is a more vibrant democracy, and a more vibrant democracy is better for everyone. And those closest to the pain must lead the fight to get there. And that last part of the quote is really critical to how Advancement Project sees the work and does the work, recognizing that directly impacted people are the experts of their experiences. And we really, as an organization, try to use our resources to uplift communities of color and directly impacted people as much as possible to ensure that it is a genuine partnership and something that really is advancing the cause of racial justice for all. Now, from the Civil War to Reconstruction to the Yickwood case that I just quoted, we saw 53 years ago a very strong watershed moment in the fight for equal voting rights in this country with the signing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 by President Lyndon Johnson. Now, this act was a culmination of decades of hard work by activists, by community members, by folks who really did want to see that brighter future and that expansive ability for communities across the country, particularly communities of color, to participate in American democracy vibrantly and fully. But, however, 50 years since the signing of the VRA, the Voting Rights Act, we find ourselves in a really tough situation. You had, in the Reconstruction era of American history, more overt voter suppression tactics like poll taxes or grandfather clauses, but certainly, especially since the Supreme Court decided a case called Shelby County v. Holder in 2013, a number of voter suppression tactics have popped up throughout the country in our current era. Voter suppression laws like strict voter ID requirements, the elimination of early voting and same-day registration in spaces throughout the country. So recognizing the watershed moment of the VRA and its signing, and then 50 plus years later, recognizing that much work remains to be done is critical. And especially with that Shelby County case, which essentially got rid of a pre-clearance formula for formerly covered states that had histories of racial discrimination in voting. Before this case, these states had to submit certain voting changes in their voting laws to the federal government. But this Shelby County case essentially eliminated that requirement and opened up the floodgate for these voter suppression tactics that we're seeing now. So with all of that historical context in mind, we can get into the mechanics of voter registration in Florida and what that will look like for the next 8 weeks or so leading up to the November 6, 2018 election. So to start the meat of this part of the presentation, there are a few requirements to register to vote in Florida. The first being that a voter must be 18 years old. The voter must also be a resident of Florida and a U.S. citizen. I'm going to skip down to the fifth bullet point first. The person must not have been declared mentally incapacitated by any court of law. And then going back to that fourth bullet point, as it presently stands, a person must not have been convicted of a felony Now, I say that with an asterisk because the current process requires for folks who may have a felony conviction to petition what's called the Office of Executive Clemency. But there is a ballot initiative on the November 2018 ballot for Floridians that might change this process, which we'll discuss a little bit later on in this presentation. How and where to register to vote. So Floridians have a few options. The first being online registration, going to the website registertovoteflorida.gov. There are also in-person and mail-in options for government agencies that one may go to for services, such as the Department of Motor Vehicles and the tax collector's office. These are places where one can register to vote and submit an application. And then there is also an option to download an application and submit it to what we call your local supervisor of elections, and more on that term soon. Usually with a mail-in option, you will be required to give the last 4 digits of your social security number. But all of these can lead to voter registration. So a few important dates and deadlines to keep in mind for the November 2018 election. The general voter registration deadline is 29 days prior to the election, which translates to October 9th, 2018. There is a period of early voting in the state of Florida, which will take place from October 27th through November 3rd, 2018. And it is important to keep in mind that voters can vote early at any polling place, any voting site within the county that is open. So as long as that site is open during the October 27th through November 3rd period, a person can vote within their county at an early voting site. And more information about early voting sites is available on the Florida Secretary of State's website. And then another thing related to voter registration covered on the previous slide, once that application is submitted and processed, one will receive a voter registration card in the mail. That is important to keep in mind that the voter registration card can't be used as ID. We'll get into valid forms of ID very soon. Now, when one does receive that voter registration card in the mail, you can go online to verify your registration at this website listed. You also can contact, as stated earlier, the local supervisor of elections, the election official, perhaps within your county, who is responsible for the county's voter rolls and making sure that they are accurate. Now, a point that may come up in recognizing that life happens, and particularly for people of color who may have to move more frequently due to various circumstances, we wanted to highlight what the procedure is for updating voter registration when moving to another county before the election occurs. So a voter who moves to another county within the state of Florida or even within the same county can update their address by calling, emailing, or writing to the supervisor of elections. And once that is done, the voter will receive a new voter information card, which is can tell you about the polling place and where to go to vote. And also there's a thought of moving within your precinct, and precinct means a very localized area where you go to vote, or that covers your voting space. So if a voter moves from a precinct but remains in the same county, that voter can vote as a regular voter under 2 circumstances: if they are an active military member or a member of the family of an active military member, or if the county uses an electronic database at the polling place. Now, generally, once your voter registration is verified, you may have to complete what's called an affirmation, which may require you to sign a document or sign something affirming that you are indeed who you say you are on the voter card. And then if the registration cannot be verified on election day, the voter may have to submit what's called a provisional or temporary ballot, which we'll discuss a little bit more soon. One thing to keep in mind, so there is the election registration deadline, the voter registration deadline of October 9th, and there may be an event where a person moves after October 9th, but before November 6th, when the election occurs. And in that scenario, you're certainly urged to keep that initial voter registration card and then perhaps follow up with your local supervisor of elections, again, with an email, a call, or a letter to see what perhaps the procedure might be to ensure that the voter registration card that you bring with you on election day is the one that will indeed apply. Now, certainly in Florida, there are a number of groups, voter registration groups, that engage in this type of work to ensure that democracy in Florida, and certainly in America more broadly, is as robust as it can be and will register people to vote. It is important to note that in Florida, there are obligations and a registration requirement for groups that do voter registration work. There is a specific form that's available on the Secretary of State's website, and it must be filled out and emailed to this email address that you see on the screen. Now, there are, again, certain requirements or obligations of voter registration groups in the state of Florida. So if a group does engage in this work and is registered, these applications that are collected must be delivered to the State Division of Elections no later than 10 days from the date of collection or the registration deadline for an upcoming election, whichever is sooner. So in this scenario, say there's a county fair in your county and you are working with a voter registration group and it's going to occur this week. Once all of those applications are collected, they need to be submitted within 10 days of the county fair. Since it's sooner than October 9th, which is the voter registration deadline for the November 2010 election. Now, with all of this preparation in mind, let's move on to election day and what you will see and what to expect. So again, the idea of voter ID. Florida does require voter identification when you go to the polls. There are a few options, several options, as you see on the screen, ranging from a Florida driver's license to a credit card. There can also be identification issued by the United States government, such as a U.S. passport or military identification to use as identification when you go to vote. Also student ID, which is important for the idea of college voting and voting as a college student, which we'll discuss very soon. And then a host of other voter IDs that can be used, as you see. Now, again, back to that alluded to concept on the previous slide, college students can vote in Florida. They just need to use their campus address for the registration. And student IDs can be used as a valid form of voter ID when college students go to the polls in person. And taking a step back, it might not be that a person necessarily lives on campus. in attending college, but whatever address is used for the college registration can be used for the voter registration. And then in this context, college is very broadly defined. Any what we call accredited institution of higher education, from a community college to a state university to a private university. The election day hours. So polls will be open for 12 hours on November 6th from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Now, if a voter is waiting in line at 7 p.m. on election day, they'll still have an opportunity to cast a ballot, whether it's traditional or provisional, temporary. Political activities are prohibited within 100 feet of the entrance of a polling place, and there usually will be some type of indicator at your polling place to say where 100 feet from the entrance is. And then to find your local polling place, you can visit the local supervisor of elections website at this link on the page. Now, Floridians do have access to assistance with voting at the polls if it's so required. Florida voters can generally ask for assistance from anyone at the polls, say for three big exceptions: an employer, an agency of an employer, or a union representative if the voter works in a union job. Florida polling places are generally going to have what are called Americans with Disabilities Act ADA compliant touchscreen devices as the accessible voting system. And it's important to keep in mind that if one lives in a nursing home facility, under certain circumstances, the voter may be able to participate in supervised voting from within the facility. In addition to ADA compliant devices, there is language assistance that is available in Florida. One under Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act, which was mentioned earlier, that law that requires election officials to provide language assistance under certain circumstances. And particularly in Florida, there was a U.S. Census Bureau determination made that the state needs to provide language assistance and translation of election-related materials in Spanish across the state, across various counties. Now, I did want to make note of a lawsuit that was filed earlier this year on behalf of Puerto Rican folks who were displaced after Hurricane Maria, who are now residing in Florida. Just recently, last week, a federal judge ruled that sample ballots need to be provided, Spanish sample language ballots need to be provided to assist Puerto Rican voters, tens of thousands of Puerto Rican voters who will be going to the polls on November 6th. And certainly that fortifies this idea of language assistance being available for Floridians and for folks who are voting. There's an option, instead of voting traditionally at the polling place, of voting by what's called absentee ballot or voting by mail. And Floridians can request their absentee ballots for the November 2018 election from October 2nd through October 9th of this year. The request can be made online at the local supervisor of elections website, which is accessible at this link. Now, the ballot does have to be received by one's local supervisor of elections by 7 p.m. on election day. Certainly when the polls close on election day, it must be received. Now, what happens if one is challenged at the polls? There might be two situations or or two arenas in which provisional voting might come up. One might be if a person doesn't have an approved form of voter ID as listed on the previous slide. But even in that case, the person should still be allowed to cast a provisional ballot. Now, there might be a scenario in which a person's eligibility is challenged by another person, another voter. And in that situation, the voter can consult with a poll worker at the precinct and request a provisional ballot. And these provisional ballots do represent a really critical set of voices and should be counted. And there is more information that we'll share very shortly about how to ensure your provisional ballot is counted. So with the provisional ballots, in the first situation that was expressed, if you do find that you don't have your ID on you or an approved form of ID, you don't have to provide any additional evidence of your eligibility to vote. You'll be allowed to cast and should be allowed to cast your provisional ballot, and then the local supervisor of elections or election official will check your registration with their records and count that provisional ballot eventually as a regular one. However, if your eligibility is challenged at the polls, if somebody is saying for some reason you can't vote or in the wrong place, you will be required to vote using a provisional ballot, but the law gives you a few protections. One, that you receive written notice of your rights as a provisional voter, and it will also provide you with information on ensuring that your provisional ballot is counted. In either situation, a provisional voter will likely be required to what's called a test or sign a document to their belief that they are registered to vote. And then following up on that, there is a way to ensure that the supervisor of elections receives evidence of your eligibility by going to that supervisor of elections with some form of ID or some proof of your eligibility by 5 p.m. on the second day following the election, which is November 8th, 2018. Now, there's a very thin line between a challenge that's made against a person about their eligibility to vote and then perhaps forms of voter intimidation that you might see as you go to the polls or even as you prepare to go to vote. So you might see intense shouting directed toward you or abusive language, someone repeatedly asking the voter about their citizenship status, someone lying about being an election official and deliberately misleading people about voting requirements, bringing a gun to a polling place, and then misleading posts on social media. So you may see, especially in the couple of days leading up to the election, somebody posts something false like voters of this party vote on this day and voters of other parties vote on another day. And then within all these forms of voter intimidation, or perhaps separate from them, you may see the presence of police officers at your polling place, which can be an off-putting thing as folks go to vote. But simply know that these folks should not hinder your ability to exercise your right to vote, that you should still have access to a polling place and be able to cast your ballot without fear or intimidation. Now, what to do if any of these occurrences come up or you see any of this behavior? It can be documenting the occurrence, taking notes if you have a pen or pad, perhaps capturing it on a smartphone with a picture. If it's a social media post, perhaps taking a screenshot of that post that is offering misleading information. You can also report the activity to a poll worker and the supervisor of elections within your county as well. And also, Advancement Project is a member of the National Election Protection Coalition, The intimidation can be reported to that hotline or to that website. So it's either 866-RVOTE.org, or you can call and report the occurrence to 866-687-8683. And then also, a person can consult with local advocacy organizations and poll workers to determine what next steps might be required. So there are a few recommended steps for strategic engagement ahead of the election, of the November 2010 election. With all of this information in mind, certainly. One is to meet with the county supervisor of elections at least 45 days prior to the election, to just go over a few things that we'll get into, particularly recommended questions that you can use to guide that conversation. Now, also monitoring voter purges. So there's a federal law that's been around for a few decades called the National Voter Registration Act, the NVRA, that prohibits election officials or supervisors of elections from conducting mass purges within 90 days of a federal general election. This goes back to that idea of voter registration verification. If you notice in your community that a number of people are going to verify their registration and saying that their names are not included on the rolls, this could be a point to bring up to a supervisor of elections and say, look, the NVRA prohibits these mass purges and they shouldn't be taking place. One can also encourage community members to sign up to become poll workers. And then back to the slides about voter registration groups, if you participate in that work, ensuring that all members of the group are up to speed on the requirements of voter registration groups and obligations, mainly that those voter registration applications of other people need to be turned in within 10 days of you receiving them. So the concept of being a poll worker has come up a couple of times in this presentation, and poll workers have to be registered voters, but they're also paid positions. Poll workers play a really critical role in ensuring fair election administration, and poll workers in Florida, they typically have to complete a couple of hours of training. There are ways to get involved by checking with your supervisor's website, the supervisors of elections within your county, on more information concerning becoming a poll worker. So a few final steps and concluding thoughts. Going back to that idea of meeting with the supervisor of elections at least 45 days prior to the election, here are a few guiding thoughts and questions that you may want to use during your meeting. You ask the supervisor of elections if they have closed or consolidated any polling places, if so, where are those polling places located, and how did the supervisor of elections notify voters about these polling place changes and closings? Another question, what are some of the common problems observed when processing voter registration application? What happens if the registrant's information does not match the information in the state or federal database that the supervisor of elections uses to verify identity? Under what circumstances will voters be removed from the voting rolls in advance of the November 2010 election? And how will the voters be notified of emergency polling place changes on election day? Which can be a big issue. A few other questions and thoughts to kind of keep in mind. How are voter registration applications processed if mailed before but received after the deadline? How you respond to poll workers and or challengers in the polling place who insist on improperly challenging voters. All right, so keep in mind those forms of voter intimidation that you might see, and it's certainly not an exhaustive list. It may take other forms. And then if there are observed problems at the polls on election day, is there a direct number that the election supervisor would be willing to share to ensure that contact can be a little bit more seamless? So if you'd like to get further involved, organize a community meeting to review registration deadlines, perhaps in some communal space, and any polling place changes that come up. Review the requirements for registering voters to vote, especially if you're involved in a voter registration group, and then inform community members of the existence of this ballot initiative that was mentioned earlier that we'll discuss a bit more on the next slide. And this stands to potentially restore the right to vote to approximately 1.5 million Floridians. So this ballot initiative will appear as Amendment 4 on the ballot on the November 2018 ballot that the folks will see for you. Now, this amendment is a constitutional amendment and it would potentially restore voting rights to approximately 1.5 million people presently who are unable to vote due to a felony conviction. Now, with all of this information in mind, and I know it was a lot, I certainly want to open it up for any questions that folks may have who have participated. All right. Didn't see any, but we just want to thank you so much for tuning in to this webinar. Certainly feel free to reach me at my email address or at the office, both listed on your screen. And please do follow Advancement Project on social media, ADV_project, certainly on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, for updates on our voter protection efforts throughout the fall 2018 election, and for more information on the work that our Power and Democracy program will be doing ahead of the election. We also have nationalrighttovote.org, which is a specific website to track some of our voter protection efforts, and we certainly encourage you to go and check it out. And again, just one more disclaimer that this presentation was intended to provide general advice and was not intended to be legal advice or create an attorney-client relationship. Thank you so much for joining, and we wish you all the best as you prepare for the fall 2018 election. Take care.